Time usually feels like a river we are swept along, steady and indifferent. Yet the river has a hidden spring that no clock remembers. A first wet glimmer before the current learned to flow. And tonight we walk toward that spring with a lantern held low, letting the dark do half the thinking while we ask what it means to speak of the universe before time. Because if time is the stage on which everything happens, how do you describe the rehearsal that taught the stage to exist at all? Cosmology names that first act Big Bang, but the name is shyer than it sounds, less an explosion, and more a hot beginning where space itself expanded, cooling the world broth until light could travel without being instantly swallowed. And even this is a description with its back to the wall, because the earliest moments do not welcome language. A boundary known as the Planck-era, where gravity and quantum antics share the room so closely that our equations glance away, which is why origin stories always keep one door ajar. The earliest readable page arrives much later, when the universe had cooled enough to let electrons and protons settle into neutral atoms. A moment when the fog lifted and the first light we still see as the cosmic microwave background began its slow journey. A photograph developed across billions of years that reveals tiny temperature freckles, and from those freckles grew galaxies. Yet the photograph does not show what happened before the fog thinned, which leaves a beautiful discomfort in place of certainty. Between the beginning we cannot compute, and the photograph we can. A brief, powerful proposal stepped in called inflation, a burst of accelerated expansion that smoothed wrinkles, flattened space, and stretched quantum jitters into the seeds of structure, an idea that makes puzzles behave, but creates new ones about what drove it and whether it ever truly ended. And in this trade of mysteries, we recognize a pattern that ancient myths already knew, that every solved riddle breeds a better one. Long before telescopes, people stood under palaces of sky and told stories about all this using the tools they had. Metaphors of eggs split open by song, of oceans stirred by a serpent, of voids bridged by a god who walked on wind. And though the names differ, the motif repeats, a beginning wrestled from a prior stillness that was not yet time, a hush that yields to rhythm after a promise. And in the rhythm, calendars and temples learn to keep faith, which is how memory becomes architecture. In that architecture, the night was not empty but instructive, a blackboard on which the moon taught months and the sun taught years, and the planets drew their tangles like patient tutors. And across centuries, those lessons hardened into cycles, precession and eclipses and great winters, rhythms that implied an order deep enough to be trusted with crops and coronations. And if order exists, origin follows naturally as a question, because order begs for authorship, even when the author refuses to sign. Science inherits those same habits with sterner instruments, writing equations where hymns once were, and building detectors that can listen for whispers older than stars. And the whispers we have already heard suggest a universe astonishingly simple at first glance, homogeneous and isotropic on large scales, patterned by acoustic peaks frozen into the microwave background, like ripples caught mid-ring. And those ripples let us weigh the age and contents of everything. But weighing is not the same as remembering. The truth between myth and measurement sits in the understanding that both are attempts to make the present honest. Myths by placing us inside a story larger than our fear, and measurements by refusing to let fear speak at all. And the question of before time is a test of this honesty because it refuses to stand still, inviting metaphors without mercy and equations without witnesses. A double invitation that we accept by walking slowly enough to see both shrubs at the path's edge. We will walk backward through the chronology we trust, past the first atoms and the first stars, past the chemical recipes that cooked in stellar cores and the gravitational loafing that built galaxies, until we feel the last figure ground reversal, where time and space are no longer background but behavior. And there we will rest for a moment and listen for ideas that try to make that reversal comprehensible, because listening is the only tool that works at borders. At that border, we meet proposals brave enough to say there may have been a before to our before, bounces from earlier cycles, brains colliding in a higher space, universes budding like foam from eternal inflation, or a beginning that is not a point at all, but a rounded, boundary-less garment that contains time the way a globe contains directions, and whether any of these garments fit is an empirical question that our future instruments may dare to ask in the yaws, language of waves rather than words. The danger in a theme like this is romance, the temptation to fall in love with an explanation because it charms us rather than because it survives tests. And yet the opposite error is just as perilous, to pretend that what we cannot yet test cannot be worth imagining. And between these cliffs, the narrow path of useful wonder runs, path laid by minds that know humility is not the enemy of ambition, but its spine. So we dim the lantern a little and let our eyes adjust, because much of the universe reveals itself only in peripheral vision, and the periphery tonight is crowded with both ancients and accelerators gesturing at the same horizon, a horizon that might not be a wall so much as a mirror. And mirrors are only cruel when you refuse to look at them kindly, which is where we go now, with patience and the promise of a sky that remembers more than it shows. Begin with the egg that sings itself open, because across continents and centuries, the cosmic egg appears with a stubborn grace, a closed perfection that cracks under a pressure that is not violence, but timing. A shell that holds opposites until they are ready to be named. And when the yolk splits into heaven and earth, the story says this is not destruction but birth. A reminder that beginnings can look like endings when you mistake a shell for a prison. In another world ocean, a serpent coils around a pillar while a god stirs the primeval waters, and the churn becomes geography, foam becoming mountain and crest becoming cloud, and the sea that was once unformed becomes home under a sky that learns rhythm. And under that rhythm people learn to count, which is the true purpose of a cosmogony, because counting calms fear, and fear, without counts, grows petals into teeth that the night does not deserve. From the Vedic hymn that doubts everything, except the possibility that it is permitted to doubt, to the Chinese tale of Hundan, a featureless chaos that dies when friends try to shape his 7 holes, a caution that not every formlessness wants your corrections. The myths sit with the uneasy idea that before order was not evil, but unshaped goodness, a mist that hugs rather than hides, and that order must earn its place without arrogance, which is as modern as it is ancient. Norse singers sketch a gulf called Gin Ongap, an empty that is not nothing but frost, breathing on fire until a giant melts out between. And from that first paradox, heat in love with cold, the world unwinds in genealogies of stones and storms, and even when a wolf eats the sun, the song insists this is part of the schedule, because schedules matter more than villains when you are building a calendar from fear into faith. In Mesopotamia, a storm god wins a war against a sea that had grown unruly, and from the carcass of that ocean, the sky is stitched and the rivers are taught which way to go. And while the violence disturbs, the stitching consoles, suggesting that whatever strife we inherit threads too. Threads that make maps across a cosmos that could have stayed trackless. And the existence of a map is the miracle myth cares about. On the Nile, the waters rise in a rhythm, learned so well that scribes could plan taxes by stars and pharaohs could aim tombs at constellations that promised fairy service for souls. And this intimacy between sky and stone bred a confidence that the visible heavens echoed in invisible grammar, a confidence that made prediction sacred rather than merely useful. And sacred prediction is a musician more than a judge, a companion to humiliation when floods forget the rehearsed beat. In Mesoamerica, the gods build worlds as if training for patience, several attempts ending in jaguar teeth or winds that encouraged likeness too far, until a stable agreement emerges where maize and rain and time itself discover the gift economy of reciprocity. And an agreement like that requires ritual maintenance and laughter as well as blood, which reveals another truth songs cheerfully keep, that creation is not an event but a practice. Aboriginal songlines braid earth into sky with such fidelity that a traveler can carry a map by humming the positions of stars and the stories anchored to rocks, ensuring that memory is both portable and shared. And in this hovering over land and night, the notion of a dreaming that is both before and always runs with grace, a time that undergirds time without being swallowed by it, a kind of prelude that never finishes and never begins, which rhymes with modern physicists more than they might admit. These accounts are not fossils of ignorance, but living codes for survival, because to build a culture, you must tame the terror of randomness without smothering the reality of surprise. And in that balancing act, stories used images of sound, breath, eggs, and waters to capture the felt truth that order blooms from a softness first, from something that holds without naming, and the power of that softness is preserved even when later ages forget its name. Out of stories grew instruments that tracked the promises the stories made, alignments that catch solstices and standstills and asterisms, whose risings told farmers when to plant. And these instruments trained eyes to notice drift, precession of the equinoxes, the slow rock of the sky across millennia, a rocking so slow it feels like a sigh rather than a motion. And in noticing drift, minds learn to love long spans the way witnesses learn to love pauses. And from this, love science inherits patience. Patience gave birth to pretensions that frightened its own parents, like the claim that the heavens do not care if kings win, that comets are part of a family of orbiting stones, rather than portents sown by a god's mood. And later still the recognition that everything visible is a minority, ordinary matter a thin veneer over darkness that neither shines nor stumbles. And the myths look up from their balls and nod, because they had always suspected that the visible was hospitality rather than essence. When modern cosmology walks into the room, it brings its own creation songs, equations as austere as a monastery, and instruments as persuasive as a chorus. And while the metaphors change, the structure remains, a past that is strange and kind enough to write the present into legibility, a present that returns the favor by asking after the past with courtesy. And the courtesy is important because the past has an excellent memory for tone, which is how we will proceed as we step from mythic hush into microwave light. Turn the calendar back to a universe that has just become transparent, when temperatures have fallen enough that electrons can stay married to protons without the wedding being disrupted by heat. And in that first clearing, the photons that had been jostled constantly are finally permitted to travel, a permission we measure today as microwave glow from every direction, a near-perfect black body with tiny wrinkles that are the handwriting of sound. And those wrinkles are the tenderest fossils we possess. From those wrinkles we reconstruct the concert, pressures and rarefactions in the young plasma, ringing like a drumskin drawn over all of space, peaks and troughs, whose spacing tells us how fast light traveled and how much matter and radiation were in the hall. And the audience was gravity, applauding by letting denser regions gather more, a positive feedback that spawned stars and galaxies, all of it seeded by quantum fluctuations stretched into macroscopic seeds, which is the sort of amplification that makes a poet smile at an engineer. Before that concert, there is a problem that cleverness discovered by accident, that regions of the sky now too far apart to have exchanged light look nearly the same, a uniformity that demands a coordination meeting nobody could have scheduled under local rules. And this is the horizon problem, a polite crisis joined by the flatness problem and the absence of magnetic monopoles, a trio that sang together long enough to invite a new voice, and that voice is inflation. Inflation proposes that for a brief breath, space expanded faster than the speed of light can carry a signal, not violating relativity, because it is space itself doing the swelling, and the effect is to stretch any initial curvature into flatness, to iron out temperature differences, and to magnify quantum jitters into the seeds of structure, solutions delivered by a scalar field rolling down a potential shaped to do this work, a field that does not introduce itself at parties, but leaves flattering notes, which is why it continues to be invited. Evidence piles up in patterns, acoustic peaks in the microwave background that fit inflation's rehearsals, galaxies clustering in filaments whose statistics echo that early music, and the size of primordial fluctuations consistent across scales, an agreement persuasive enough that inflation has become the default opening act, even as theorists argue about its engine, the potential's shape, and whether inflation is eternal, reading pocket universes forever like yeast, a fertility that makes some uneasy and others relieved. After transparency, the universe fell into a long night, dark ages where neutral hydrogen-filled space and stars had not yet flickered on, a time we are beginning to explore by listening for the 21-centimeter line red-shifted into low radio frequencies, a line that reports on temperature and ionization in a language of hush. And when the first stars lit, their blue fury rayonized the fog and changed the chemistry forever, a violence that was also a gift, and we are only now building ears sensitive enough to hear the first notes. Some questions do not go quietly, even when models are compelling, like the current tension over the expansion rate measured from the local universe versus the rate inferred from early universe patterns, a disagreement called the Hubble tension that could be systematic error or new physics peeking coyly from the curtains, and alongside it the details of how quickly structures grow, sigma 8s and weak lensing results hinting at slight misfits. And misfits are often where a field grows rather than breaks. Dark matter, the quiet mass that shapes halos without shining, remains a biography without a portrait, candidate particles jostling for auditions, without landing the part, while dark energy, the smooth pressure that accelerates the expansion, sits in equations like a shrug with consequences, and their dominance in the cosmic budget is a reminder that knowing the outline of a painting is not the same as recognizing the face, an asymmetry that keeps cosmology humble even when its graphs look confident. The dream of hearing gravitational waves from the very beginning persists like a distant bell, A-B mode polarization pattern in the microwave background that would record space-time's own tremor during inflation. And while past claims have been corrected after dust cleared its throat, the search continues with instruments more attentive than before, because a detection would not only weigh the energy scale of inflation, but also offer a proof that the early universe left fingerprints we can still smudge, and fingerprints are irresistible when you love origins. Step closer to the opacity, and the language for what came before becomes thin. Planck units governing behavior, where every attempt to reconcile gravity and the quantum is an unproven dialect. And in that thinness, the task is to be both careful and imaginative, to avoid pretending ignorance is knowledge, while also refusing to leave the room, because the lights are low. A balance that makes the next ideas more fragile and more valuable at once, which increases the responsibility to ask well. Asking well means distinguishing between what is suggested by necessity and what is invited by taste, between features our universe seems to require and those we append to make our models less lonely. And yet taste has always guided exploration, choosing which hypotheses to dignify with a lifespan. And so we will let taste help us again as we entertain proposals that speak of befores and beside, knowing we are sampling without swallowing, and ready to return to the data as a friend. The door we now approach is the one with the sign that says beware. Time under construction, where proposals try to move the singularity from a hard wall to a tender rounding, or to replace it with a bounce, or to embed it in a mother space that offers context without condescension. And at this threshold, the night is sweet with possible futures for pasts, a sweetness that tastes like patience more than sugar, which is the only flavor that stays with you long enough to be useful. When people say before the Big Bang, others wince at the grammar, but grammar is pliable when space-time is, and one proposal answers gently that there was no boundary at all. Only a rounding or temporal direction loses, meaning the way north loses meaning at the pole. A no-boundary condition that treats the early universe like a sealed smoothness, finite without edges and past without a past. An elegance that holds you until you ask what chooses such boundary, and questions are happier than answers here. Another line draws a bounce, a contraction preceding expansion, in which energy density climbs. Quantum gravity stiffens space-time against singularity, and a minimum volume is reached from which expansion rises. And loop quantum cosmology toys with such rebounds by giving geometry a discrete grain that resists infinite compression, while ekpyrotic models imagine brains in higher dimensions, colliding softly enough to seed structure without catastrophes, an intimacy of surfaces that never quite touch in ordinary senses, and yet remodel a cosmos with a kiss, a metaphor physics tolerates because the math is surprisingly severe. Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology takes a different road by declaring that remote future and primordial past may be conformally equivalent when only massless particles remain, a trick of stretching and squashing that lets one eon's emptiness become another's beginning. And in such pictures the arrow of time is rescued by the loss of scales, a rescue that is as bold as it is controversial, with claims of faint concentric patterns in the microwave background proposed as signatures and disputed as statistics having a little too much fun. A dispute that keeps both sides honest. String cosmology joins with a prelude of its own, a pre-Big Bang phase where the Latin field's roll and curvature grows from negative values toward a high curvature transition. And string gas cosmology explores a hot state with extended objects whose winding and unwinding around compact dimensions decide which dimensions expand. A topological selection rule that hints at why three spatial directions became hospitable while others curled into invisibility. An answer teased by dualities that say very small can look like very large. A symmetry that feels like a myth smiling through algebra. Eternal inflation. The idea that the process never fully ends, but keeps breeding new pockets where it does, paints the multiverse as a foam, where pocket universes have differing low-energy laws, a chaos tempered by local order. And in such a schematic, the question of why our constants look tuned becomes a demographic answer rather than a design, an anthropic shrug that is unsatisfying to some and medicinal to others. And even if the multiverse is true, extracting testable predictions is a frontier that prefers humility to hubris. Some ideas turn the lens toward black holes, wondering whether their interiors birth new universes, where the constants are slightly mutated, a cosmic natural selection in which black hole-friendly laws reproduce more often, a conjecture that wraps information paradoxes into fertility tales. And while these visions are not yet measurable, they alter the way we think about what singularities are, and whether they are curtains or doorways, an alteration that may be productive even if the furniture never arrives. Emergent time proposals reach further by suggesting time is not fundamental at all, but a large-scale phenomenon arising from entanglement and thermodynamics. That space-time geometry is a weave of quantum information whose stitching creates directionality we call a moment. And in such visions, the past is what is maximally recorded, and the future is what is not yet woven. A poetic operationalism that becomes less poetry as calculations behind black hole thermodynamics and holographic dualities sharpen, a sharpening that is delightful because it changes what to ask. The arrow of time itself, the asymmetry that lets eggs break but not unbreak, demands its own origin story, and candidates multiply. Low initial entropy as a boundary condition, gravity's peculiar contribution to counting states, cosmological horizons that hide information, and thus permit a growth of ignorance that we experience as flow, and each sketch sits uneasily until paired with a concrete mechanism for why low entropy was allowed in the first place, a permission that might be granted by a deeper theory, or might simply be a fact we cannot reduce. And the honesty to admit both possibilities is itself a kind of rigor. Amid all this, hints and claims flirt at the edges, whispers of odd alignments in the microwave background called the axis of evil, cold spots possibly born from textures or voids, circles that some claim to be scars of pre-existing structures. And with each whisper, teens run statistics until the whisper becomes either noise or a new stanza, a discipline of restraint that keeps speculation from curdling into doctrine, which is crucial when the subject tempts certainty with emptiness. The laboratory has not given up on meeting these ideas halfway. Tabletop experiments probing quantum superpositions of space-time with interferometers, searches for violations of Lorentz invariance that would signal a granular space, atom interferometers listening for ultralight dark matter tides. And while these do not speak directly to a before, they tighten the leash on many models and train our hands to be gentle enough to greet an effect that might otherwise slip past. And gentleness is the first virtue at thresholds. Through all the technicality runs a human undercurrent, the suspicion some harbor that official stories hide what cannot be admitted, that funding favors tidy narratives, that data with inconvenient flavors are quietly salted away. And while institutions can be clumsy, the better conspiracy is structural, a bias toward the solvable over the merely beautiful. And knowing this lets us compensate consciously, creating room for hypotheses that are risky without letting the room become a theater of wishful thinking, a balance that protects wonder while sharpening teeth. We stand then at the railing of a balcony that opens onto a landscape we cannot yet cross, listening for a sound that may be gravity's own memory or a chemical fossil in the oldest light. And the next chapters depend on whether those sounds consent to be recorded, a dependence that humbles even as it energizes, because the difference between a thought experiment and an experiment is the permission of the world, and permission is earned by the quality of our questions. A new generation of instruments is being taught to ask differently, a network of telescopes counting ancient whispers rather than new fireworks, starting with radio ears built to hear the 21-centimeter sigh of hydrogen from the cosmic dawn. Arrays on quiet deserts and proposals for a radio observatory on the moon's far side, where earthly noise cannot intrude. And the promise is a tomographic movie of structure arriving, a film in which we might see the fingerprints of a prelude, if they reached forward far enough to leave smudges in the timing of first light. Closer to the afterglow, missions like Light BIRD and the Simons Observatory and CMBS-4 prepare to chase polarization patterns in the microwave, background with a discretion that previous surveys could not afford, refining our sense of primordial B modes that, if real and not dust, would weigh the scale of inflation and maybe disqualify certain prehistories while sparing others. And even a non-detection is potent, tightening the corridors through which theories must pass, corridors that reward lean ideas and starve indulgent ones. In the infrared, space telescopes peel back curtains on the first galaxies, catching star clusters that formed when the universe was a toddler, and watching their spectra for oddities that betray new physics. And with each detection, the tension between early and late measurements of the expansion rate sharpens or softens, a live diagnostic that indirectly informs how we imagine the prelude, because whatever came before must still flow into the symphony we now hear. And discordant preludes usually leave scuffs on the first notes. Gravitational wave astronomy, young and already confident, dreams of a space-based observatory like LISA, listening for the bass lines of massive black hole dances and perhaps for a stochastic hum from the early universe, while pulsar timing arrays stretch the technique by turning millisecond pulsars into a galactic detector. That can feel space-time's slowest tides, and each method opens a different window that inflation and its rivals predict differently, a difference that might be just audacious enough to distinguish. Particle physics listens from the other end, hunting for axions and other shy candidates that could be dark matter, measuring neutrino properties with monkish attention, because the universe's first seconds were choreographed partly by neutrino whispers, and building laboratories underground and under ice, where cosmic noise is silenced. And these pursuits look local, but they are cosmological in ambition, because a mass measured at the surface of the Earth may rewrite a paragraph near the universe's first heartbeat. Even geology is conscripted as a cosmological witness. Growth rings in ancient corals that tell about day length long ago, and sediment patterns that record tidal cycles, fossils of timekeeping that tattle on the rate at which the Earth-Moon dance has changed. And while this speaks to later epochs, it trains a habit of reading subtle, cumulative signatures that cosmology uses when it reads baryon acoustic oscillations in galaxy maps and Lyman alpha forests in quasar light, a shared literacy that links seashells to superclusters in a single patience. The most delicate frontier remains the question of whether time itself can be coaxed into revealing its origin with a local experiment. Efforts that probe entanglement entropy in engineered systems, analog black holes and ultra-cold gases that emit phonon-Hawking radiation, and quantum sensors whose coherence might be brushed by a granular spacetime. And while these are metaphors more than replicas, nature has often allowed metaphors to be stepping stones when the river was too wide, and the stepping teaches balance even when it does not cross. Back at the level of equations, theorists refine models as if whittling an ore, shaving assumptions and smoothing potentials, learning which initial conditions are generic and which are tuned, reconsidering measures in multiverse landscapes that badly want a census, and debating whether a cosmology that leans on anthropic reasoning is conceding defeat or recognizing selection effects that would be dishonest to ignore. And the civility of this debate matters because impolite arguments are poor listeners at the edge of data. Our culture stands to gain something quieter than answers from this work, an apprenticeship to an age of attention, where long questions are allowed to stay open without becoming wounds, and where students can be taught to love questions that will outlive them without feeling betrayed. A civic skill in short supply elsewhere that the night sky continues to tutor, because nothing trains courage like looking at a blank that might be beautiful and refusing to scribble on it before you can see. On a hill where no lights interfere, stone markers from another era still frame horizons with a precision that embarrasses our excuses. And standing there with modern sensors humming softly, it is possible to feel the fellowship between people who told creation stories with breath and people who now tell them with statistics. A fellowship that protects both from zeal, because zeal is the enemy of listening, and listening is the one art that both myth and measurement require from anyone who hopes to approach a beginning. The image that returns at the end is not a blast, but a hush, a pressure of possibility like fog over a field before dawn, a mist in which eggs might sing and brains might brush, and fluctuations might choose to linger. And the world we know condenses from that hush, not as an inevitability, but as a kindness we can repay only by caring for the questions that left us. An ethic disguised as cosmology that may be the secret all origin stories we're trying to teach. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.